What makes someone a good Jew? Is there even such a thing as being a better or worse Jew? And what would that be based on? Is that about how many commandments I fulfill or how many times I've read through the Bible? Is there even a way of knowing whether I'm a good Jew or bad Jew? And more importantly, what difference could there possibly be for the way that we live our lives right here, right now, today? I'm Chaim Davies, and this is the Chaim Davies Show. Welcome back to the show. So, measuring the subjective merit of anything is so limiting that it's usually hardly worth discussing. So, is this a good car? Is it good? Good in contrast to what? Are we asking whether it can fulfill its most basic tasks? Is that called good? It can get from point A to point B? Most of us wouldn't refer to some rusty, beat-up Oldsmobile that still can roll down the street as a good car. Well, then what is a good car? I drive a 2010 Charger. Is that a good car? Compared to the Oldsmobile, yeah, it's good. Compared to a Rolls Royce, it's hardly scrap metal. And this is true in so many areas of life. Good and bad are usually terms which are defined in relativity to one another. So this takeout food is terrible, unless, of course, I'm starving in Siberia, in which case it's this miraculous goodness that I've been blessed with. And the truth is, we often relate to morality in these relative terms as well. So what makes someone a good person? So we tend to think of, a decent-mannered person who isn't confrontational, probably a law-abiding citizen, doesn't have major family conflicts, right? Doesn't get into spontaneous fights on the subway, probably pays his taxes. He's a good person. And obviously, if we would place him against the backdrop of a group of Nazis, let's say, then obviously he'd seem like a fantastic individual. And also, if we would place that lovely gentleman against the backdrop of a panel of Nobel Peace Prize winners, back when that used to mean something, he would obviously not look like such a great person anymore. He'd probably come across as mediocre at best. So it's usually pretty ineffective to ask whether someone or something is good or bad without defining our terms and creating a contrast. So when we think about being a good Jew, the way that we usually use that term has the similar connotation to the way that we use the term good when we're talking about being a good student. So we mean that in the sense of obedience, usually. So if a student recognizes the teacher's authority and follows the instructions, the teacher might say that she's a good student, as if obedience somehow became the metric for success. But again, that's why using these terms are usually so unhelpful. But we tend to use the word of being a good Jew or a bad Jew in that same way. So if I study God's Torah and I become a great scholar, then I'm being a good Jew. If I'm following God's rules and not violating his commandments, then I'm being a good Jew. I think you can probably see where I'm going with this, right? It's a pretty petty way of thinking about what constitutes goodness when it comes to our relationship with Judaism. So is there such a thing as good or bad Jews? Well, let's define some terms. There are words in the Torah which describe, at least in their most crude usage, whether a person has accumulated more internal merits or corruptions, zechut or avon, through the performance of the mitzvot and averot, following the commandments or violating God's instructions. So the Rambam writes about in Hilchot Tshuva, the laws of return, that tzaddik, or righteous, refers to someone who has more merit than corruption, more zchut than avon. Rasha, wicked or evil, refers to someone who has more corruption than merit. Now, the Rambam stresses there that the important point to remember is that that's not the same as saying someone who has done more good deeds than bad, or bad deeds than good. We're not talking about quantity over here. Being a tzaddik or a rasha, righteous or wicked, isn't about tallying up your deeds and seeing whether more of them were fulfillments of God's will or violations thereof. The commandments don't have their own relative weight on their own. The significance of the mitzvot or the averot is actually based on their quality, which is based on how the mitzvah or how the avera was carried out. So as the Rambam there says, a single action can equal dozens of others, right? Whether it's a mitzvah or an avera. And the Rambam also makes the point there that determining whether I or anyone else is a tzaddik or a rasha isn't something we're capable of doing. It's only something which can happen in the mind of God. Only God knows the innumerable number of subliminal motivations, the thoughts, and all the influences which play into each and every one of our decisions, and then how all of those decisions compound and interrelate to come to define what we've become. And so any attempt to label ourselves as righteous or wicked is ultimately futile. Now, obviously, there are going to be some situations that it seems pretty clear to us, right? I think most of us can agree that Hitler would probably get the Rasha label without too much careful assessment. But in general, right, the Rambam is saying that even if a person fulfills mitzvot their entire life, there's no way for one of us to know for certain what status that person would end up with, whether they are indeed a tzaddik or whether some choices in their life came to overshadow all of the righteous things that they did. And yet, even with all of this, it's kind of hard to escape this nagging feeling that being a good Jew has to do with doing what we're supposed to do. I mean, if I'm spending all my days sinning away, right, could anyone in good conscience refer to me as a good Jew? I mean, if you're telling me that it isn't about the number of transgressions per se, then what is it that makes that qualitative difference of mitzvot versus avirot? Now, I just want to point out there that we kind of just subtly shifted in our thinking. We went from talking about mistakes to talking about spending my days sinning away in this almost sinister fashion. And that's already a question of quality. But before we get into what creates the quality of action, I think we need to deprogram a few misleading words that we've been using for far too long in our vocabulary. There's no equivalent word for sin in Torah. The word sin in English is most likely a derivative of Latin and shares the same roots with the word for guilt, another concept which really has no equivalent in Torah. But there are a family of Hebrew words which are used to refer to not following God's instruction, and each one of them has a different connotation. So the most commonly used word for this is chet. But what does chet mean? So there's one instance in the Bible where the word is used in a very illustrative way. And actually the Ramban, the great Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman of the 13th century, actually points this out in his commentary on Leviticus, on Vayikra. So we have this story at the end of the book of Judges, Shoftim, where the nation of Israel is on the brink of a civil war against the tribe of Benjamin. So the verses describe there how each side called up army reserves to the front lines. The other 11 tribes against Benjamin brought 400,000 armed and trained soldiers, whereas the tribe of Benjamin, who were obviously outnumbered, bring out their sharpshooter squad. And the way that these sharpshooters are described is very revealing. So the verse says that Benjamin mustered up 26,000 soldiers along with an elite squad of these 700 sharpshooters. And these were highly trained professionals with incredible accuracy in their shot. I mean, obviously they weren't shooting bullets, but they were slinging stones. And they could nail a shot from a mile away. Says the verse, an incredible language that's used here. It says that each one of them could sling a stone at a target of a single hair. They could aim at a tiny single hair, velo yachati, and they would never miss. The word chet means to miss the intended target. With precise aim and some practice, so the word chet means to miss the intended target. It means to be aiming for a goal, but to end up off course. So why is the word chet used to describe not following God's instructions? Because the truth is, we all really want what's best for us. We aren't intentionally self-destructive. Sure, we always think that this activity or that choice will ultimately be the best for us, be the most pleasurable for us. We have our sights set in the right direction, but we miss the mark. We're aiming in the wrong direction. The Torah is an instructions for living. It's a roadmap to creating an ideal society of the nation of Israel and for actualizing our individual potential. And it's letov lanu. It provides us what's truly good for us. So when we sidestep God's instructions and we end up taking another path, we're not sinful. We're just missing the mark. We're aiming in the wrong direction. And this is why the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin says that Yisrael afal pi shechata Yisraelhu. A member of Israel who makes a mistake, who misses the mark, is still a member of Israel. You're still aiming in the right direction. You want pleasure. You want to achieve goodness in your life. You want to have what's right. We've simply missed the mark. And it's for a similar reason why the generic term for not fulfilling God's instructions is averah, which comes from the Hebrew root ayin vet resh, meaning passed over. It's a missed opportunity. We had a golden ticket, a chance to achieve true goodness with our lives, and we passed it by. We missed the opportunity. That's an avera. And this is also why the Talmud says an amazing thing. Ein adam choteh, ela im kein nichnas bo ruach shtut. A person only does a chet if he was essentially possessed by temporary insanity. Because if you knew that the Torah was truly a guide for your best life, and you really knew that deeply, then you'd never veer from the path. We only make the mistakes that we do because we manage to temporarily delude ourselves. distracting ourselves from the truth and the relevancy of Torah. But of course, that's not the only possibility. Sometimes we act out with deliberation. Sometimes the choice we make to bypass God's instructions is intentional, it's well-informed. And in that case, the Torah refers to it as avon, coming from the word me'uvat, meaning corrupted or warped, twisted. Our perception of reality and our relationship with God has taken a hit for the worse, and our integrity of viewing what's good as good has been warped and requires to be re-straightened, requires to be realigned with a derech hayashar, with the straight path. So there's no word which really carries the same implications as sin does in English. Right? The question of our intentions and our context plays such a big role that it's hard to say that a mitzvah or avera carries any intrinsic value on its own. In fact, the Talmud in Tractate Nazir even debates which is better, an avera done in order to come closer to God, however a person manages to convince themselves of that, or a mitzvah done for ulterior motives rather than for the ideal, for building a relationship with God. Can you imagine this? A serious scholar in the Talmud argues that an avera done for the right reasons could be worth more in God's eyes than a mitzvah lacking the proper intentions. Now, it happens to be that the Talmud there concludes that they turn out they're equal, which is shocking in its own right. But I only bring this up to show how it's not simple to decide what makes a person a good Jew. And if it isn't about how many mitzvot we perform, and if it isn't about how much of the Talmud that we study, then what is it? So we end up wondering, what does God want from us in giving us all these mitzvot? What's the anticipated outcome? Is this a test of endurance, of allegiance? Some form of litmus test to see how obedient we are? What does the Almighty, so to speak, hope to see from our efforts? So there's a fantastic line in the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin about this very issue. The great 4th century figure Rava couldn't come to grips with understanding a social development of his time. So in the previous generation, in the times of the great Rav Yehuda, the spread of Torah wasn't all that great, and it was certainly inferior to that of Rava's time. And yet Rav Yehuda was known for having these amazing prayers, right, which would be answered almost immediately, whereas Rava's own prayers often seemed to him to go unanswered. And so Rava was bothered. I mean, shouldn't it be that one's greatness in Torah should manifest itself in the manner in which God answers our prayers? I mean, isn't it one and the same? If I'm great in Torah, then God will be very close to me. But then Rava understood, and he taught us in the most incredible words. He says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu liba bai. The Holy One, blessed be He, wants the heart. For God, our achievements aren't quantified in the number of Torah statements we've memorized. What God is seeking out in this world is not blind allegiance, but hearts, the caring core of a human being who has given himself to the relationship of Torah. Torah finds her pair in the yearning soul of a Jew. Only a person who relates to Torah and mitzvot in a purely relational sense, who has his heart in the right place, creates that relationship, which is what it's all about. So if we want to know if someone's a good Jew, whatever that would mean, we should be looking not into their actions alone, but into the heart, into the amount of passion which motivates those actions. So, there's an incredibly powerful episode in the Talmud which cuts to the essence of this issue. The Talmud tells of the great 2nd century scholar Shmuel of Naharda, who once encountered Rav Yehuda, the same rabbi from the previous story, who was crying in the doorway of the house of study, the Beit Midrash. And Shmuel was bewildered and asked Rav Yehuda if he was all right. And so Rav Yehuda began to explain how, all things considered, the odds of success in Judaism seem hopelessly stacked against us. I mean, a quick survey of our nation's history shows that even the most observant Jews fell to some of the darkest lows. So many of the great scholars of early generations have dropped to such unfathomably distant levels. I mean, Yeravam ben Nevat, an officer who served under King Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, and experienced the divine presence in the building of the first temple, ultimately tore apart the nation into 2 kingdoms and caused tens of thousands of Jews to worship idols. Or then you had Menashe, who grew up in the home of King Chizkiyahu, one of the most righteous leaders to ever lead our people, and who was the same one who restored the services of God to our people after decades of an intense lack of loyalty to him. And his son Menashe unleashed over 50 years of fanatical idolatry, murder, immorality on the nation. He converted the temple into a house of idolatry, of Avodah Zarah, and turned Jerusalem practically into one big brothel. And then you have Elisha ben Avuya, one of the giants, a contemporary of Rabbi Akiva, who is listed as one of the 4 rabbis who entered into the deepest areas of esoteric mystical thought, and yet who ultimately became a heretic, rejected the covenant with God, and ultimately would spend his time killing other Torah scholars. What are we to make of all of this? How could it be that a person could reach such tremendous heights, fulfilling every last commandment, plumbing the depths of Torah study with such diligence and commitment? I mean, talk about being a good Jew. And so Rav Yehuda was struck by all of this. I mean, what chance do we possibly have? If these people who achieved such phenomenal heights in Torah study somehow ended up amongst those who lost everything, then how can we expect to wind up any better off? And Rav Yehuda was crushed by this daunting reality. But then Shmuel turned to him and spoke to him just a few words which changed his life. He said, "Shinana, my dear and clever friend, you've misunderstood. Tina haita belibam. They had dirt in their hearts." Those people, tremendous scholars they were. Tremendous people they were not. No matter how much they learned, nothing was ever allowed in. Torah was a matter of the mind, of action, but not of the heart for them. And so, being denied access, their Torah always remained external to who they are. You see, studying Torah and performing mitzvot is like dyeing a piece of cloth, he said. When the sheet is clean and unblocked, the dye absorbs easily and enters into the innermost fibers of the material. But if the sheet is stained or coated with tough blockages on the surface, the dye will never penetrate to the depth of the cloth. If anything, it will just leave the most superficial effect on the outermost layers of the fabric. And so, explained Shmuel, the same is true with Torah. The clogged pores of those scholars' hearts, caused by their own thick protective inner coatings, made of the most basest drives which they had, caused them to act like slippery shields of prevention against Torah's natural, powerful effect. Sure, I mean, all of their resources dedicated towards intellectual mastery of the Torah, obviously they made it further in their sophistication of Torah thought. Yet with all of that immense potential was given no chance for expressing itself in their lives because of each of their surrenders to the tainted coatings inside of their hearts. And so when Rabbi Yehuda heard this from Shmuel, he was consoled. It wasn't the number of books memorized or ritualistic behaviors performed which mattered in God's eyes. It was the heart, the passion, the honest and sincere commitment to translate knowledge into feeling and live to the heartbeat of that eternal relationship, which really mattered. So we want to know what it means to be a good Jew? The answer to that question doesn't start with talking about which rules you keep or which you don't yet understand. It doesn't start with your philosophies of Judaism or with the number of volumes of the Talmud you've completed. And no, it doesn't even start with which institutions you donate your Jewish money to. It starts with what's happening on the inside. Are you open to being inspired by Torah, by Judaism's gorgeous teachings? Or have you closed yourself off? Have you locked yourself into trappings of your own making, of limitations, of excuses, of reasons why you just aren't ready or capable of letting the covenant course through your veins? Or are you open, vulnerable to allowing Judaism's powerful impact within you? You know, the poet David White says that vulnerability is the place where you're open to the world. If you're willing to really experience Torah, if you're open to having your perspectives in life changed and shaped by the Torah, rather than applying it topically to your life like some cheap Band-Aid, then you've already begun the path of being a good Jew. And you can stop worrying so much about whether at the end of the day your actions weigh out in your merit or not. If you're committed to the cause, if you're open and willing to experience what Torah has to offer, you'll find yourself continuously drawn to greater heights. And as the rabbis say, in one of the most amazing, incredible lines of the Midrash, Halavai oti azvu v'torati shamaru. God says to the Jewish people, if only you would stop keeping my mitzvot and just treasure my Torah. Umitoch shahayu mitaskim ba, if you would only engage in my Torah, hameor sheba haya machziran lemutav. That engagement with Torah, says the Medrash, the light within it will draw you back towards good. The potency of Torah itself can awaken some incredible things within you, can draw out all sorts of realizations from within us, but only if our hearts are clean and open and unshielded to allowing that experience to take place. And so it's that commitment to Torah, that interest in discovering more about yourself, more about Judaism, more about the relationship between God and Israel, which really forms the first step to answering our question, what does it mean to be a good Jew? And if I can look into myself, if I can kind of unpack my own identity and see that I share this 3,500 years with this nation called Israel, with an instruction manual for living, a Torah Chaim, and see that as really being part of who I am, but in a biological sense of where I come from, in an existential sense, in the sense of how I got here, where I am today. And I can start seeing those pieces as being relevant and having something to say about how I'm supposed to live my life moving forward, then I've already begun discovering the steps along the journey of a good Jew, someone who's open, who's interested in allowing the Torah, the mitzvot, allowing a relationship with God to be influential in their life, to be part of their own identity. So being a good Jew isn't about celebrating the cultural events, about eating latkes on Hanukkah and going to synagogue on Yom Kippur. It's about identifying with the cause of the people. It's about understanding that at the heartbeat of who you are, in your identity, when you look back and you see 3,500 years of commitment, of allegiance to building that relationship with God, to discovering who we are and who we're meant to become through the instructions for living, through the Torah itself, that's where being a good Jew is about. It's discovering that I'm interested in learning more about that I'm open to receiving from the Torah. I'm open to allowing myself to experience what the Torah and the mitzvot have to offer. It is that which ultimately begins the first step to discovering what it means to be a good Jew. I'm Chaim Davies, and this is the Chaim Davies Show. See you all next time. I hope you enjoyed that segment of the Chaim Davies Show. If you did, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell or follow our podcast so you can stay up to date on all our future content.